This is why this plan is a regional one. It is entirely possible that we will see a significant number of refugees prioritizing one country over another, or that internally displaced persons will opt to return home rather than to cross an international border. The plan, therefore, puts the emphasis on preparedness rather than on a heavy response component at this stage. Given the critical COVID situation, especially in Iran, we have an unusually high ask in regard to health assistance. It is critical that both refugees and hosts are protected and that vaccines are made available to all. The RRP, the response plan, is also an acknowledgement that we have not received the support that we need for existing Afghan refugee populations. Together, Iran and Pakistan host almost 90% of all Afghan refugees, and they have done so for over 40 years. Their hospitality and inclusive policies spanning decades and generations cannot be taken for granted. For more on this situation in Afghanistan and the needs, I'd like to turn over now to our colleague Wafa Saeed from OCHA. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Yes, indeed, this is the summary that we have just distributed to you. You should have received it. And now let me give the floor to Wafa Saeed Abdelatef. Wafa, you are the director of the coordination division of UN OCHA. You'll tell us more about the situation on the ground, please.
Okay, thank you so much. Before I start, I would like also to echo this collective horror at yesterday's attack. It's brutal, senseless that took place at the airport, and also to pass heartfelt condolences to those who lost loved ones. And yet, while it's been another blow to the Afghan people, it is also for us to strengthen our resolve to provide support and to provide solidarity and to continue to be of service. And actually, I want to say 3 key points, and I will elaborate a little bit on them. My first point is that the humanitarian needs are catastrophic, are at large scale, and are increasing. The second point is that despite some of the constraints that Kelly flagged them and some of disruption and challenges, humanitarian response has not stopped and is continuing as we speak. And my last point, to continue to address this critical humanitarian needs, we need on one hand, respect to humanitarian principles, protection of the humanitarian workers, men and women, but also we need financial resources because the plan for the response inside the country is very poorly funded. So starting by the humanitarian situation, at the beginning of this year, we estimated that around 18 million people are in need of humanitarian assistance. This is almost half the population, and it is a staggering number. And this was at the beginning of the year. So as we speak now, a lot has happened, and we expect that these needs have actually increased. And these humanitarian needs are coming from decades of conflict, compounded by drought and by COVID-19. And just to give you some statistics about the needs, I think now we are facing the second drought in 4 years, which means people did not have time to cope, to build their assets. And we are estimating that at least 1/3 of the people in Afghanistan today are either at what we call crisis or emergency level of food insecurity, which means they don't have enough to eat, they are depleted their assets, and that if they are not assisted quickly, their situation would get much worse. We also estimate that half the children under 5 are acutely malnourished. And when a child is malnourished, this means also not access to enough food, to health, to water, to hygiene, to sanitation, and also malnutrition has a severe and irreversible impact on children. So this is something that we cannot let continue. Also, in addition to critical food insecurity, the malnutrition, this year we have seen the highest increase in number of casualties, and the majority of them, actually 1/3 of these are children. And inside the country, we have, I think Kelly flagged this number, more than 500,000 people were internally displaced, and of around 130,000 of them were displaced just last month alone. But as I mentioned also in the beginning, despite the challenges, despite the constraints, the humanitarian response is continuing as we speak today in Afghanistan. And we as humanitarian agencies, we have experience and we know how to operate in conflict settings and in war zones despite the challenges. So the response continues despite the challenges and some of the constraints flagged by Kelly. And since in the first 6 months of the year, we have reached around 8 million people. And of these 4 million people were reached in the last 3 months. I just would like to conclude by the point mentioned that we also need respect in this context of humanitarian principles and protection of humanitarian workers, both men and women. And I'd also like to say something about the funding, because when we have launched the plan for the response inside Afghanistan at the beginning of the year, we have appealed for 1.3 billion. I would like to thank the generous donors who provided around 500 million, which is around 40% of the plan. And part of this has also gone to the OCHA managed country-based pool fund that is managed within the country, and the Central Emergency Fund that collectively provided around 50 million to support the response in Afghanistan, but we remain short of $800 million. This is needed urgently because the level of supply now are being stretched, because also we are coming to winter and there is also not only the scale of the funding, but the urgency of the funding, and we need these funds to be flexible. So I just want to conclude that we need the respect of humanitarian principles, protection of the aid workers, men and women, and we need the funding because the needs are already growing. And lastly, I just also want to acknowledge and to thank the humanitarian workers who are, as we speak now, despite great risk, continue to provide assistance. So thank you so much, and over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wafa, for this update. Our next speakers, I really don't need to introduce to the Geneva Press Corps because we have had the honor to have him often with us, is Manuel Fontaine, the director of the emergency programs of UNICEF. Manuel, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, and greetings from Kabul. I think I just want to start from the point of both known by Kelly and Wafa, which is this important commitment for humanitarians to stay and deliver. And so what does it mean? Staying is not easy at the moment in Afghanistan and in Kabul, but in the rest of Afghanistan as well. But there is a strong commitment to do that because we need to deliver. And I think some of the numbers just mentioned by Wafa are quite striking when you're a humanitarian, half of the population in need of humanitarian assistance. But that's 10 million children, 10 million children in need of humanitarian assistance, just even before the winter is about to hit. And we know how the winter is in Afghanistan, combined with the drought that we've been living for some time. 1 million children suffering from severe acute malnutrition. I was, 3 days ago, I was at the pediatric hospital here in Kabul and talking to the doctors and the nurses, and they were actually saying they're getting increased numbers of children who needed to be treated. And I can tell you some of them were actually doing very poorly. It's also 4 million children who are actually out of school at the moment. So these are very, very important and significant numbers, which means we need to deliver. And this is why we're staying. Now as Wafa indicated, a couple of things that are important. We're still operating. The services are ongoing. Again, at this hospital, it was really strong and important to see nurses and doctors, women, many of them being women actually, working at the hospital, immunizing children, treating them for severe acute malnutrition, providing all the kinds of support that actually young children need in that particular moment, including emergency support. Services are ongoing also in the rest of the country as much as possible at the moment in health services in particular. But at the same time, I think we're trying all together with all the partners, all the agencies here to set up emergency services, it's support to displaced people, it's mobile health clinics or health teams, it's the digging of wells in some parts of northern and west Afghanistan at the moment. So it's really trying to do our work, do our job. Interestingly also, some of the remarks made by some of the doctors of saying, well, actually it seems now that some of the people have better access and are able to actually come to the hospital in Kabul and get the kind of services, but it's the same in different places. So this is important. At the same time, I think we're not naive. We know it's going to be difficult. We know there'll be a lot of issues coming up. We're humanitarians, we're experienced. We know how to deal with those issues, and we will have to actually take them up front. Obviously, funding is going to be really important for UNICEF. It's an appeal of $192 million, almost a little bit more, half of which has been received, but there's still a big gap. And in addition, obviously, the need to be able to access people. And of course, I just want to end by saying how horrified we've been by the bombing of yesterday. Many children actually killed or injured in that terrible bombing. So obviously, we want to stand by all those people and share all our sympathies and condolences. But again, all the organizations here are committed to stay and do their work, and this is important. Thank you.
I hope you can hear me. Thank you very much, Manuel. That is really an important information. I like now to go to our last but definitely not least speaker, Najiba Wazida Fost. Najiba, you are the Chief Executive Officer of the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees, which I understand is the only region-wide refugee-led network of refugee-led initiatives in the Asia and Pacific region that is working with and for refugees. You have the floor.
Great. Sorry, I couldn't unmute my mic. Thank you very much. I mean, we all know that Afghanistan is right now at a very dangerous point. We've been speaking about the horrifying situations already from the other speakers. Ahead really lies a tragically intertwined state of crisis. And we're talking about an increasingly brutal conflict combined with an acute humanitarian situation and multiplying human rights abuses. With the withdrawal of foreign forces, obviously many people did fear the prospect of the resurgence of the Taliban, but few people were pessimistic enough to believe that the Taliban would regain control over the country so quickly. The people of Afghanistan have experienced 40 years of displacement, and it is quite horrifying for us to see the rapid escalation of human sufferings as well as displacement within the country. And again, I have to say, this is in addition, to other issues like drug displacement, the food insecurity, and the COVID as well. Many Afghans from the provinces, as we all know, are under threat of the Taliban, have already moved internally, and some with the other means available are actually also trying to leave the country and go into countries like Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, Tajikistan, and elsewhere. I mean, for us in APNOR, it has been quite heartbreaking, especially in the past week, receiving vast amount of calls through our Afghan crisis helpline, where people have been reporting executions and beatings and clampdown on media and radio stations. They've been reporting to us about Taliban's, door-to-door searches, targeted killings, and looting in the capital. And again, we've been hearing about schools and hospitals and thousands of homes being attacked. All roads leading to and going out of the cities are being closed by the Taliban. Hospitals, as we already heard, have nearly reached full capacity and really can no longer accept patients. And again, we've heard from our speaker from OCHA, again, the available food that's fastly diminishing, as well as a shortage of medical supply. But with all of that, what's been the most concerning is around the voices of fear that we hear from women. They tell us that they fear of being killed simply because of being a female. Hundreds of women and girls and children are brutally persecuted, and some are telling us that they're publicly beheaded or stoned. We worry that the situation for Afghan women in particular is deteriorating so rapidly, and we are particularly concerned for their safety and other human rights defenders in Afghanistan. We do worry that the borders, which are closing in response to the pandemic, will prevent Afghan women from fleeing violence and persecution and from finding safety. We worry that Afghan refugees living around the world might not ever get the chance to see their families again. And we worry that governments that are turning inwards in their response to the crisis in Afghanistan might and will ignore the needs and rights of women and girls who cannot count on the local authorities to protect them at times like this. So with the terrible news last night, as we all talked about it, it's been quite, difficult for us to hear about the numbers of women and children being killed last night, and speaking to women just hours ago, describing how they have become prisoners of their own gender. And they're all facing real challenges, like real concerns about survival. So a lot of people telling us in APNO that they're really facing this coming darkness with a sense of being abandoned by regional and international community. They are expecting far greater engagement and visible support from the international community. UNHCR has done so much to support, Afghanistan for decades, and we are still urging UNHCR to take, concrete steps to lead the global responses to support forcibly displaced, as they always have, and ensure that the principle of responsibility sharing and international unity enshrined in the global compacts of refugees are upheld. Refugees and displaced people must not be, a mere afterthoughts, but their needs must be given a priority. Afghans are in a great danger, and their protection is both a moral imperative for those in a position to help and a matter of enlightened self-interest for governments wishing to see stability, in the Asia region. And I would like to conclude that how important it is, for the local-led organizations, for NGOs to be actually supported and funded. As much as we are talking about conflicts, we are also hearing so much around the immediate humanitarian funds, which is not available right now, and people are echoing for support. So with that, I would like to conclude and say how important it is for us to have a global mobilization of financial and human resources, because it's urgently needed in Afghanistan, and countries and international community should really continue to expand its funding for humanitarian assistance. And again, I have to say ongoing and flexible funding is so needed to respond to immediate humanitarian concerns and supports the efforts of organizations working to assist people displaced within Afghanistan and to the neighboring countries. UNHCR has always engaged refugees, and we hope that they will continue meaningfully engage refugees, especially Afghan refugees, in designing the UNHCR response to the Afghan crisis. And since the GCR came into effect, UNHCR has touted refugee participation as a priority for their organization, and for good reason. As people who have gone through the refugee process ourselves, we provide crucial insight into the needs of people you serve. So now it's time to realize this promise. And thank you so much for having me tonight.
Thank you very much, Najiba. I'm getting questions about the places we are speaking from. So just correct me if I'm wrong. Kelly is speaking from Geneva, Wafa from New York, Manuel from Kabul, as he said, and Najiba, you're in Sydney, if I understand well. So this is the places where all our speakers are talking from. I have already a long list of questions, and I start with Emma Farge. Emma is our correspondent from Reuters. Emma, you have the floor.
Thank you. Hopefully you can hear me. It's a question for UNHCR, please. I was hoping that you could talk us through these scenarios you mentioned. You said the 500,000 would be the worst case scenario. What would have to happen, do you think, in order to prompt 100,000 additional refugees? And what are the lesser scenarios? And which of the scenarios do you see as most likely? Thank you.
Kelly, would you like to answer, please? In press conferences, we answer questions as they come.
Okay, very good.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question. Yes, this is obviously a really dynamic situation. And in scenarios like this, as you've mentioned, Emma, we do look at various possibilities, and it's based on political situation, security situation, and others. With regard to contingency planning related to potential additional outflows, there are a number of scenarios that we've looked at different levels. And as I mentioned, the 500,000 figure is the worst case. Obviously, what we're talking about is a serious need for those to be able to not be able to seek safety within Afghanistan, but need to depart the country. So we look at ways that we can support, obviously, in the region with core relief items, with other support that we can provide to the authorities, partners coming through with various means in terms of support. So it's really pre-positioning. And I want to underscore about this particular plan, this is about planning and contingency planning. It is not the actual response. And obviously, if there was a response, We do need support now for the plan because we don't want to be caught flat-footed, and we want to continue to support those countries that have generously hosted for many, many years, as I mentioned. But there would be the need for a radical and major increase of response. And so we keep this as a very dynamic plan, and it would need to be sustained. I mentioned at the top, these are countries that have hosted for 40 years refugees in the region. 90% are in Iran and in Pakistan. And obviously they've been generous hosts, and we would hope that they would continue to do so, but they will need a lot of support.
Thank you, Kelly. Second question comes from Laurent Sierro from the Swiss News Agency. Laurent, you have the floor.
Thanks for taking my question. These are also questions for Kelly Clements. First, you reiterated the call for the neighboring countries to let the borders open. Could you get us through the current status of the borders in the different regions, and whether it's still possible for Afghans to flee by land their countries? And secondly, what's your assessment on the narratives and the decisions that were made by so far by European governments on agreeing or being more reluctant to welcome additional Afghan refugees? Thank you.
Thank you, Laurent. Kelly.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much. With regard to the situation at the borders, as you can imagine, it is dynamic. It changes hourly, if not daily, in terms of what's happening. From what we understand from our teams on the ground and from the authorities, particularly when it comes to the Iran border, is that they are seeing, and I want to go back to the top, really the humanitarian emergency currently is inside Afghanistan. We are not seeing a refugee exodus at this point. A few thousand a day in Iran, and with regard to the borders in Pakistan, it is very fluid. Basically, there's a strong commercial traffic that goes back and forth from Afghanistan to Pakistan. That continues. And in terms of the flows, pedestrian flows, and so on, it is basically it looks very much like it did several weeks ago. So we continue to monitor this very closely, and obviously remain engaged in terms of additional support. But we don't see large numbers coming forward to seek that support at this point. With regard to the support we need from Europe, obviously we've been in active touch with the top leadership for the European Union. High Commissioner had a discussion yesterday with the High Representative. They are very much looking to support ourselves in terms of the humanitarian response inside Afghanistan, but also wanting to support in terms of the refugee response, including that ongoing support that I mentioned that is so critical. They have made the call to cease deportations, which of course we applaud. And obviously we are going to need a lot of help with regard to ongoing resettlement possibilities for those Afghans, those already outside of Afghanistan, and the potential for Afghans that will not have another solution to find resettlement in safe third countries. So this remains a top priority, and obviously an active part of our conversation with each of those governments bilaterally.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Our next question comes from Christian Ulrich from the German news agency. Christian, you have the floor.
Thank you for taking my question. I'm a bit puzzled with all the numbers flying around. Maybe someone can shed light on this. We had 1.3 billion, I think, that were only 39% funded this morning. And now we have 299 billion. Is this on top of the 1.3, or is it part of it? And since the 1.3 billion have not been funded very generously, what gives you hope that this is going to be different now? Or are you going to go out of your way to find new donors or new ways of increasing the funding? Thank you.
Maybe I would ask Wafa for OCHA if she wants to say something about this, as Christian is referring to the global fund requests that had already been put out. Maybe Wafa, you can shed some light on the current.
Thank you. Thank you. I can clarify the number for the humanitarian response for Afghanistan. This is for the response within the country. It's a plan that we have already launched in December last year for the whole January to December 2021. We have asked for 1.3 billion US dollars to support around 16 million people who are in need. And out of this amount that we have asked for the 1.3 billion, we have received around 500 million. And so now we are asking for the response inside the country for additional 800 million. And as I mentioned, we need it urgently because of the winterization, because of the supply now being strained, and also because of the increased needs. So that's for the figure inside the country. Maybe over to Kelly to talk about the plan for the response in neighboring country. Thank you so much.
Kelly.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Yes, there are two responses. There's the humanitarian response plan and then this regional refugee response plan. And so what we're launching today is that regional plan. That regional plan, of course, builds on our ongoing work with many partners in the neighboring countries and steps it up in terms of contingency planning. So it's basically a step forward in that regard. Indeed, the regional activities are already underfunded. In Iran, we have only 27% of our engagement in that country supported. In Pakistan, only 50%, not to mention the other work in other regions. So we will need much more support from governments, from private sector. We have seen a lot of private sector engagement and support, individual giving. So there's clearly an outpouring of support. We're going to need a lot more of it, and we're going to need for it to be sustained. And Alessandra, if I can just come back on the last answer, I wanted to just correct the title of the conversation yesterday. It was actually with the European Commission's president, with which the High Commissioner spoke. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Kelly. Thank you also for the answer to Christian. Nina Larson from AFP. Nina?
Yeah, hi, thank you for taking my question. I also had a question for UNHCR. I was wondering if you could provide a time frame when you're talking about the worst case scenario for refugees. Within what time frame are you thinking of these 500,000 people could potentially flee the country? And which countries, I know you said it was, this is just planning, but which countries are you expecting to see the greatest influx? And then also, I mean, you just said that for now you're not seeing an exodus, and that the biggest crisis is inside Afghanistan. Are there also contingency plans for a sharp increase in IDPs, and what would the worst case scenario be there? Thank you.
Kelly.
Thanks very much for the question. Much appreciated. In terms of, you know, we've had decades of experience not necessarily getting the scenario right. So in terms of how we look at this and how dynamic it is, we intentionally have given you a document that doesn't specify by country what we're expecting, because we don't know where people are going to go exactly. And we need the flexibility to move quite quickly, including, for example, providing even more support inside Afghanistan, because people do not seek refuge outside the country, and we need to provide more of that support. So it includes our Central Asia neighbors, as well as Pakistan and Iran, certainly, which is quite important. With regard to IDPs inside the country, yes, there's been a lot of contingency planning done on that as well. I would refer to WAFA, but that is something that I know UNHCR and other partners want to step up and actually surge more support as access and security allow. Perhaps WAFA can add to that.
Wafa, would you like to add something, if she can be unmuted? You're on.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think just very briefly, because we have seen an increase in the number of people who are being displaced, and the displaced, usually their needs are quite critical. So I think one of the areas that we're trying to scale up the response is the response to these displaced people, because, you know, people, just to say briefly, people really don't want to leave their homes unless they have to. So I think we are really also focusing on supporting the response to the IDPs within the country where we're seeing the numbers increasing. Thank you.
Maybe I'll give the floor again to Nina, who has a follow-up. And I also see a question from her colleague, Agnes Pedrero, that says, could you please answer for the time frame for the worst case scenario? I guess this is maybe for you, Kelly.
That was my question also, thank you.
Yes, okay, so we have the same question. Kelly, maybe you can answer this, or Wafa?
Thanks very much. Yes, no, I neglected to answer that question. The time frame for the plan currently is until the end of the year. I mean, we're basically taking us for the next 4 months. That can change. And, you know, I may be in front of you in a month's time with a completely different scenario. It's a dynamic, it evolves, it will change as the situation on the ground changes. But we really need to ramp up our support now, particularly with the deterioration of the situation inside. But currently, time frame is until the end of 2021.
Thank you very much. Isabel Sacco from EFE.
Good afternoon. Mrs. Clement, I have a question on the situation in the Spin border crossing with Pakistan, because there are many news reports that contradict what you just said, that saying, what my understanding is, you said that the situation is, there is not a lot of pressure in the borders, but this news reports say that there are in this, especially in this border crossing, up to 1,200,000 people there, and when the evacuations will finish officially, the land border will be the last chance for people to flee the country. So I would like if you can explain what is the situation in this border crossing, also in the crossing of Khyber with Pakistan, and the situation also apparently is getting more difficult in some crossings with Iran. And finally, because I just to add that people, maybe the situation is not very bad now because people have to need some resources to get to the border, the distance, the checkpoints are difficult to pass. So there, I would like to know in that sense that what is the staff and the resources you have in the border crossings, not only in Pakistan and Iran, but also in other Central Asian countries. Please, thank you.
Kelly, please answer the question from the Spanish News Agency, but please also the other speakers, if they want to chime in, of course, just raise your hand. Kelly.
Thanks very much. So we actually had a conversation about this morning with our representative in Pakistan about what's actually happening at the border. And she had just been a couple of days ago to Chaman. And the dynamics with regard to the border, as I mentioned earlier, it's very fluid, and there is a strong movement back and forth across with commercial and also pedestrian traffic. That is not to say that the borders are not tight, and that it is not easy to get across the border, particularly without the right paperwork, ID, and so on. But on average, we see about 25,000 that go back and forth across from Afghanistan to Pakistan and the other way around daily. We've seen a small uptick in this in just the last couple of days, but we don't have people coming to seek support from UNHCR or from partners at this time that could tell us any number of things that I don't want to necessarily predict at this point. But we're watching this quite closely. On the Iran border, what the authorities tell us, and we've had a couple of visits with them to look at the situation at the border in the last several weeks, but what the Iran authorities tell us is that there are a few thousand that cross daily, but not a large inflow, and certainly not looking for support at this stage from humanitarian agencies. With regard to what we have in country, both in terms of those two countries, but also in the Central Asian countries, we have stocks basically in every location in case there is a need for that kind of support. But this plan we've put forward to the international community today would ramp that up in the region at large to be able to support the authorities' response.
Thank you very much, Kelly. Lisa Schlein, Voice of America. Lisa, you have the floor.
Right. Thank you, Alessandra. Sorry to keep you working, Kelly, but my question is for you. Although I appreciate all the remarks of the others, I must say they were very dynamic and lucid. But specifically, you keep using the word hope. You hope that Pakistan and Iran will host more refugees. Are you afraid that these two countries, that the generosity there will be waning if they do not get the financial support that they would need in order to host these, what might be 500,000 or more refugees? And also in that, that regard, I was wondering whether in your conversations with Pakistan and Iranian authorities, are you already talking about, and this is part of perhaps your preparedness plan, setting up camps, or is this premature? And when you talk about preparedness, specifically, what do you mean? Do you mean pre-positioning tents, blankets, other materials, and so on and so forth? And then, sorry to get to the money issue, this is always a rat trap, but I want to be a little clear about a couple of things. The $1.3 billion, this is the humanitarian response plan, is that correct? And this is separate from what you are dealing with today, and that is the regional response plan, right? Then there were two other money figures that were mentioned. UNHCR, $229 million. Is that what you're asking for the regional response plan? And UNICEF mentioned $192 million. Is that what UNICEF wants for the regional response plan? I mean, this stuff drives me nuts. So if you could clarify it, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Lots of questions in here. Maybe Kelly, you want to start, and then we will go for the funds to also welcome Emmanuel. Thank you.
We'll do that. Thanks very much for the questions. Hope. Yes, we have a whole lot of hope in terms of not just in this region, but across the globe, for governments to keep their borders open to people who are on the move, who can't seek or have safety within their own countries. And so this is something you hear often from us, that we want countries to keep their borders open. This is, as you can imagine, an active conversation that we have with not only the countries in this region, but elsewhere as well. And on this particular issue, obviously, we're having continued discussions and negotiations with those governments about what we can do, what we hope they can do, and how we would respond together, because it's always a response in collaboration and in partnership. So this is something that remains a very active conversation. When we talk about preparedness, it includes all kinds of aspects of preparedness. As you mentioned, making sure that we've got shelter materials, tent, food supplies, health measures, and the like, that our partners are engaged in this particular plan. This is not, we are coordinating this on behalf of the system at large, with 11 agencies and many others involved in terms of this response, so that we don't ever go it alone on these sorts of things. It's part of a large response preparedness effort. On the actual details of what we would look at, obviously that is something that we do in very close collaboration with government partners who have lead responsibilities when it comes to response. We add as much technical assistance and support as we possibly can. And this is why, obviously, that support from the international community for $299 million for the refugee response potential is so vital and so important. And maybe I can just springboard off of that. It's $299 million for this regional refugee and response and preparedness plan. The figures I think that you heard from other speakers and the like also include the Inside Afghanistan plan. And from the UNHCR perspective, I really noted what we're talking about when it comes to the refugee hosting countries. Thanks.
Wafa, I think you had already clarified the point of view of OCHA on the other funds, but maybe you want to add something, and then I go to Manuel.
No, I think you are right. The 1.3 billion is the collective humanitarian plan with UN and NGOs for the response within the country for January to December, and it is only 40% funded. And we are also concerned because the needs are increasing and we need flexible fund, we need urgent fund. But I think you are right. Maybe over to Manuel to explain the figures from UNICEF. Thank you.
Thank you. Manuel, can you give us a little bit more details on the...
Just the $192 million I mentioned is actually inside Afghanistan. So it is the part of that broader 1.3. This is the UNICEF part, of which we've got a little bit more than 50%. So still a long way to go to get the resources we need to really bring the assistance we need. So that's what it is. So it's inside Afghanistan, which clarifies.
Thank you very much. Let me see. I don't see any other hand up. Is there any other correspondent that would like to ask questions to our speakers? No, I don't see anybody asking for the floor. So I would like to come to the conclusion of this press conference by thanking very, very much Kelly Clements from UNHCR, Wafa Saeed of OCHA, Manuel Fontaine of UNICEF, and Najiba Wazel-Fadost of the Asia Pacific Network of Refugees for having been with the Geneva Press Corps today for the launch of this very important regional refugee preparedness and response plan. Thank you very much. Good luck with your important work in the next weeks. And of course, Andrei, Elodie today, but also James for UNICEF, and Jens and Vanessa for OCHA are here to help if you need more information in the next days on this matter. So thank you to you all and have a nice weekend. Thank you.